Hello everybody, it's Michael Hollands once again for Sound of the Movies. Today I have the pleasure to be joined by Brad Fiedel. On today's episode, we will talk extensively about his career as a very successful composer. Brad Fiedel worked on films such as The Terminator, Fright Night, The Accused, The Serpent and the Rainbow, Blue Steel, Terminator II, Judgment Day, The Real McCoy, Striking Distance, True Lies, and many more. Welcome, Brad.
Hi.
Great to have you on my show. I hope you're doing well.
Yes, doing well. It's a beautiful day here in Southern California.
Great. Such a pleasure to finally talk to you. And Brad, as I understand, you had started writing songs in your teens, and subsequently, after some time, you had been playing keyboards for Hall Oates. And please tell me a bit about those days and how you eventually became a film composer.
Yeah, well, I played the piano. I grew up. My dad and my grandfather were musicians, so I didn't. The acorn didn't fall far from the tree in that aspect. So I grew up as a kid being taught to improvise at the piano, and out of improvising, I did do some classical studies as well. But out of improvising, I would invent my own music, and then as a teenager, I had you know teenage things to say, and sometimes things that were more serious, and I put them into songs and started to play at little parties and things like that. I had a band, let's see, seventh grade, I would have been 14, and kept with that to a point where by my late teens, early 20s, I was auditioning for Clive Davis when he was at what was called Columbia Records at that point, and I auditioned for a number of record companies and had interest, but never quite clicked. I think I was just on the other. I was playing a kind of percussive piano, which actually I ended up being part of things like the Terminator. But I was playing percussive piano as a teen and early 20s in my songwriting, and nobody was doing that really at that point. It was all guitar. And so I auditioned for one record company and they said, no, no, no. And I had a few guitar songs. They said, oh, you sound like James Taylor. You should do more guitar. And the next audition I went on, Elton John had hit. And they said, oh, you sound too much like Elton John. So anyway, my timing was a little off, and that never really took off the ground. I did get interest. Paul Simon had a publishing company he started for young songwriters, and I got signed to them for a while. And I was just knocking around playing songs, my songs wherever I could get in the door. And I ended up doing about a 6-month tour with Hall Oates, playing some synthesizers and keyboards. And at the end of that period, I scored my first low budget film in New York. And Daryl and John, Hall Oates, we had a band at that point. It was called the Hall Oates Band, and they actually played on that score for a dance sequence. So they were playing on my first original film score as musicians, and I just went on from there.
Great. And if I'm not mistaken, you had started scoring in 1975, around that time.
Yeah, just around that time, I think. Yes, it was 75 because the tour with Hall and Oates spanned from the end of 74 into 75, and that's when I did the score for this New York film called Apple Pie that I was referring to.
Yes. And from that point on, you started writing several film scores, and also you did lots of work for television as well. Yet the film that would not only change your career, but would also change the world of cinema. It wasn't released until 1984. It was James Cameron's The Terminator. And when did this massive opportunity present itself?
It's so funny because you call it a massive opportunity. Everything is clear in hindsight, right? Because at the time, I had three agents in the office that I was assigned to for representation. And two of the agents out of the three were not really keen on me doing that movie. It was low budget. It was for a company at that point called Hemdale, and they were known for not paying their bills. So these guys were really nervous that I would do all this work and not get paid. And this young woman agent named Beth Donahue said, you know, this director, there's something about him. You really have to do this. So we kind of bent over backwards to make it work. But at that point, it was really more an investment in a talented director. I don't think anybody really had any idea the impact that the film would have. So it was down and dirty, low budget, really fast schedule. And, you know, I think my panic, the energy required to get it done really fast and under a lot of pressure kind of was reflected in the music and worked well for the end result.
And the theme is so well known all over the world and legendary even. Did you focus on finding a proper theme right away, or did you crack the main theme later on in the process?
What I tended to do, and you know, I did an awful lot of work because most of the TV work that I did were films. You know, they were long form, so I treated everything like a film. You know, whether it was going to be shown on, and which is funny because now it's more like that with Netflix and all these things that are happening. There's a real flow between the talent from the film world and the talent for television. Back then, there was a real almost class division, you know, the television people and the film people. And I never really saw it that way. And that's why I intersperse quite often film and television projects. And in fact, many of my early television projects involved way more interesting, established actors and people in the industry, like Anthony Hopkins and Vanessa Redgrave, and I worked with the playwright Arthur Miller on one television project, while my film projects were more lower budget, action, different kinds. So it's kind of interesting. It was reverse for me of what most of the film people, when they kind of turn their noses up at television work. But anyway, I usually on all of these projects would screen the project, and I would always, and with less and less success towards the end, which is one of the reasons I kind of slowly, you know, ended up not working in that part of music, because I used to really want to see the film without any music. And in the beginning, I was successful with that request. I most of the time got to screen a film without any music. And then my first thing to do would be the next day when I woke up from my sleep, before my brain even, my intellect kicked in, and I was just kind of in this state of having almost felt like I dreamt the film. I would go into my studio, sit at the piano, whatever came to me, and I would improvise and usually come up with either a main theme or at least a key piece of what I would think of as the vocabulary, the musical vocabulary that I wanted to use in my musical expression to support a particular project. So that's very much the way it happened for the Terminator. I just sat at the piano, and that whole tonality, the color of the actual melodic theme, and my left hand, I found my left hand doing the da-dum, dum, da-dum, and that ba-dum, 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 bum, bum, you know, all that stuff came at the piano, and I did a recording of that idea, and then I embellished it by experimenting with some synthesizer sounds and giving it some support. And I believe that day, late in the day, the very day after seeing the film, or certainly within 2 days of seeing the film, I played that work for James Cameron, and away we went.
Great. And you used many synthesizers, if I'm correct, on the Terminator, also including the Prophet 5, if I'm not mistaken.
It was a Prophet 10, actually, which really was just like two fives together. It was one big box that had two keyboards on it, like an old-fashioned organ, you know. And so anyway, it was a Prophet 10.
Right. And if I'm correct, MIDI technology had come around in the early 80s. Did you have that at your disposal as well?
No, it was just kind of starting out, and much of the equipment that I had at that point was just one step before. I remember they were doing some modifications on some of the stuff, but it was not ubiquitous. MIDI was not quite yet, in 83, 84. It was a new idea, and everybody, it's kind of like an update of software. You get an operating system and then they update it. Well, MIDI was a big update to the synthesizer world, and much of the equipment wasn't outfitted with it at the time a few years before when I set up my studio and bought most of my equipment. So there were some MIDI things available, but I did not have them in place. And partially, too, because I did have this Oberheim system that had it wasn't MIDI, it had its own in-house communication, these computer ribbons between three pieces of equipment that were key to that score as well. All the basso ostinatos, all the bass parts linked to drum machine parts and some bass. So there was a keyboard, a little simple sequencer, and a drum machine all tied together. And a lot of the Terminator chase stuff, the foundation, the underlying rhythm section, in a sense, involving bass sounds and percussive sounds, came from that system. So that stuff was, in a sense, like MIDI. It was three pieces of equipment communicating, but there was no way to tie together that system with the Prophet 10, which led to some interesting time signatures.
So time was also a factor on the first Terminator. And I've heard many times that James Cameron is a very detail-specific person. Did you even have time to properly communicate on this picture, or did he say, well, just go ahead and we will see what you can come up with?
Well, I did 3 films with him, and quite frankly, they were all so long ago that sometimes they kind of meld in my memory. He was new on Terminator. I mean, he had done this one other film that I don't even think he got to be the final director on. And so he was kind of new, and he had this amazing vision, and he was dealing with very clunky visual effects at that time in history and trying to get his vision down for what was considerably low budget at that time for that kind of film with what his ambitions were. So his attention to detail existed, but in a slightly less learned way, in a sense, than later on in Terminator 2 and True Lies. So my memory is that, I would just tackle a bunch of cues, a section of the film, and he would come by the studio on a regular basis, and I would show him, okay, here are these 10 pieces that cover the first, 15, 20 minutes of the film. And we would just be meeting, and as always with him, because he had his fingers in all the details, as you mentioned, his availability wasn't always very fluid. So, I would just keep going. And luckily, on that film, I don't remember offhand anything being, kind of outright rejected, just kept moving. And, maybe he had a few little tweaks that he wanted, but he didn't disagree with my main direction. He would say, yeah, I like that cue, but take the French horn melody out. I don't want the melody. Just stay with all the other stuff, or something like that. So it was pretty efficient.
By the time Terminator 2 had come around, which was in 1991 when it was released, of course James Cameron was more experienced. He had also done Aliens and The Abyss by that point. And Terminator 2 was the most expensive film until that point in time. Did the budget in some way change your scoring approach? Were you able to use more advanced gear as a result?
No, not really. It didn't really work that way. because I'm just trying to think of the simplest way to put this, because some of it has to do with the business of music and film. When you were often doing orchestra, the composer was paid a fee. And then the studio, the maker would, they'd have a basic budget for music, but they would do the payroll and pay for all the musicians. Since I was doing everything myself, everything that I did was under my control, which was really important for me to be able to experiment without a $350, even back then, the big studios were very expensive. And, it's pretty hard to experiment and try a bunch of things and reject them and try something else when the clock is ticking and the dollars are flying like that. So I had built my own studio. I was there were other guys too, but there weren't many of us who could actually put out finished product. In other words, the scores for both Terminator films finished in my studio. They didn't go to any other studio. Later on, we did another kind of more of a hybrid between starting in my studio, like on True Lies, and then finishing in huge MGM Sony studios with a 110-piece orchestra. But the Terminators were all done start to finish in my studio. My studio was always being updated regardless of the film because I was consistently working on various projects. So what happened was whenever something new that fascinated me and its capabilities came along, I added that to my studio. So at that time, I was working with a couple of Fairlight computer musical instruments. They're Australian big computer. It's amazing now how big and expensive everything was to achieve things that you can do on your laptop now. But back then, I had invested I think they were about $75,000 each, these instruments, and I had invested in them. MIDI existed, so they could be tied together. So basically, I already had what I needed to do Terminator 2 was stuff that I was already working with, which is good because on a schedule like that, with that intensity, is not really the time to start setting up and learning a whole new technology. So I jumped in with that. So yes, there was a big technical growth between the two Terminators, but it was part of a process that kind of a road that I was already on, and Terminator 2 kind of came into my life and my studio at a time when the studio included a whole different kind of technology than it had on the original film.
Could you tell me a bit about how you came up with the sound for the T-1000?
The T-1000, and actually it was one of the not the original sound, actually, I'm getting ahead of myself, but the actual, what I would call the aura of the T-1000. And in many cases, like I had a director friend who came to the premiere of T2, and I was just doing whatever I was doing. And he looked at me and he said, "Brad, you've just kind of changed the world of music in relation to boundaries with sound and sound effects, because the T-1000 is a good example. It's not clearly musical. It's kind of an ambience. It's a droning kind of aura, which I actually had for the T-800 for Arnold's character in the original Terminator. I had a different sound, but it seemed to work with these characters, to have when they appeared, this sound that kind of emanated from them, and it wasn't like a technical sound of something directly related to something that was happening with their mechanism. It was more of an emotional, put you in the mood of feeling how scary they were, or feeling, this whole idea of the underlying idea of the Terminator films, of the potential scariness of artificial intelligence. It was kind of, that was underneath it all for me. And this was a machine sound for the T-1000 that actually came from organic, orchestral, like almost, later it was clearly, it was kind of the sound, I can't even describe it, but if you could imagine a bunch of slide trombone players warming up in a studio and kind of sliding their slide, doing all this thing. And then I took that and manipulated it and played it way down lower than it would be possible on a real instrument. And it became this kind of, I don't know, talking about it with Jim, and we were talking about it almost like these weird monks kind of chanting in a big echoey hall. This kind of this kind of weird sound. And so the thing about Terminator 2 that kind of, I always like to be experimenting and playing with something. And the thing that I was experimenting with was the capability of creating these weird sounds that worked for this science fiction setting, but they almost all of them originated from something acoustic. So, if there was this weird kind of stringy, almost representing violins, but not violins, somewhere under that sound that I had created was a sample of actual wood acoustic instruments being played and recorded, and then I would turn it upside down and backwards. But there was in a bizarre way, I would say, a warmth to the T2 score because of that. Terminator was almost entirely just like electricity coming out of a wall and being manipulated through filters and oscillators, creating certain waveforms. And it was all very, very, except for the piano and the electric violin, the synth sounds were very electronic in the purest sense of that word. And the Terminator sounds were really more like, almost like musique concrète. They were real sounds that came from the world and were manipulated.
The main title sequence of T2 to me still stands as one of the most impressive ones for any action picture. And you did a fantastic arrangement of your main theme. It's really fantastic. Did you actually know right away which sounds you wanted to add or what the arrangement should sound like? Or did you have to do many arrangements in order to really fulfill your own vision?
No, it was interesting because it was a sequel, and we did agree that, the theme was the theme. So I wasn't hunting from square one like I was in Terminator. We had some idea of the melody and the rhythms and the basic shape of the theme. And then the whole thing about Terminator 2 was that I was getting pieces of it. Terminator, by the time I was hired on Terminator, there was a cut of the film. So I immediately screened the entire film, though of course it was missing some effects. In Terminator 2, I was hired earlier, so I actually started from the script. And I had already been thinking and feeling some things, but I tried to hold back a little bit because I didn't want to get ahead of, it's one thing to read something, it's another thing to see what actually, what the camera captures. There's often times when director can give you a script and talk about his concepts for the film. And the thing that excited me about James Cameron from the beginning was he would talk about this amazing imaginative idea he had about the film and its impact. And then when you saw it, it was actually there, which was, without meaning to be critical, but my experience in Hollywood on the level I was working, often the director's concept had this very ambitious idea, and then you would screen the film and it wouldn't really be there. So I got in the habit of not trying to get too far ahead till I actually saw the film. What happened with T2 was I got the film in bits and pieces. And I don't remember the exact order, but I started to get a feeling from the pieces that I was receiving of the scope of it. Because, it was a huge leap in size and depth and story. And it just wasn't that, was a very different project. So I think that's when I knew I wanted more obvious. There's some choral influences. The strings are more orchestral and warmer and bigger in scope. All that stuff kind of developed organically.
On May 28th this year, Terminator Life will be performed at the Royal Albert Hall in London. If I am informed correctly, you were involved as a consultant And what can the audience expect of Terminator Life? What can you tell me about this project?
I have to tell you, I got when I was contacted by Maggie O'Herlihy, who is the head of Avex Entertainment International. She's the person that inspired this big company to take on this idea of music live with film. I mean, this has been happening in other areas, but she had a vision of it, and when she told me she wanted to take on Terminator, I was kind of stunned because it just, everything I had seen was like, okay, here's Star Wars with a huge orchestra and John Williams conducting or whatever. There was a certain picture I had of music and film live and what the audience expected. And I thought this was quite interesting and ambitious because knowing how I created the score, which was basically me and my friend Ross on electric violin, I'm trying to picture how it could work. So part of that whole process is they had already put together, actually, nothing I did for the Terminators was written on paper. So they actually, some poor gentleman took on the task of listening and transcribing every note of those scores. And originally Maggie wanted me to study the score, and I said, no, I'm not going to do that because this score has nothing to do with music on paper to me. I understand why you have to do it, but seeing the notes on paper won't mean anything to me. I'm not going to, because it's so much about the sounds, about the environment and the attitude. So really what they did was quite impressive. They put together an ensemble. And it's amazing because she and I were kind of in sync because I was thinking about how could you make Terminator look interesting for an ensemble on stage, though you should be watching the film, but there's a band involved, right? And you don't want the band to be just five guys sitting there on synthesizers, It's not very interesting to look at. So I had a thought and she had already had the thought. And so a lot of the percussion, not all of it, is performed by ceremonial taiko, Japanese taiko drummers. They have these choreographed movements and everything. And since the score is just percussion, such an important part of it, that was one thing that happened. There's a regular drummer as well playing, like electronic drum set. There's a few keyboard players, and I, made sure that they had an electric violinist since that was such a crucial part. So my contribution originally was to make sure that the ensemble had the capability. So I believe that originally they hadn't thought of the electric violinist, and I said, oh, that's so important for the chase scenes and it's also visual. It's somebody can be playing their heart out. You can actually see a musician moving and having physical expression. So it was really cool because Maggie and I had these conversations, and she was very open and grateful for my input, and I was grateful for being treated in this respectful way where my input was received well. And then they did that test of it in Lucerne, Switzerland, and I watched the video, and it was amazing how well they did. But there are a few tweaks. My goal in helping and being a consultant on this, which is coming from my music, was not that it had to be exactly the same. I don't think that's realistic for live players. And what I really wanted to make sure is that the energy was right. That where it needed to have a certain real drive and edge, that was there, that the sounds weren't too soft and round or so there were occasional. I got the luxury of listening to the track of their preview, and then going back and listening to my original tracks and kind of using technology, running them together so I could switch back and forth and kind of show them, well, no, this is actually you got the notes right, but it should be an octave lower, so it's really ballsy. It's a little too mid-rangey or whatever. And so they were very open, and I went over to London, and after doing several weeks of work on it, kind of presented to them the tweaks I thought that would be helpful.
Yes.
And I have not heard the end result. They were very receptive of that, and I haven't heard it. People love the original. This is just to move it a certain percentage closer to what was in my intention. So hopefully, this new version, which will be premiering officially at Albert Hall in May. And I think there are some other dates before that, but yes. I will be present and do. I might play a little bit on the piano before the show and do a little Q&A before the show at Albert Hall on May 28th.
Great. I'm sure fans are looking forward to it. I mean, those scores have been so popular, and it comes as no surprise to me that finally those scores will be, or the very first score will be played live and performed live in front of a big audience. So I'm sure the fans will have something to look forward to. And Brad, now I would love to talk a little bit about Fright Night. I mean, you had been so busy in the 80s and also in the 90s. And one of the scores you had worked on during the 1980s was Fright Night. But actually, the score you had written was not released until 2011.
It's hard to remember all this, but there was a release. There were some songs on the release and some score, I believe. I don't know. It's hard to remember these things. People ask questions sometimes, but the full score release
yes.
was recent. Unfortunately, I did not have the material anymore. I mean, the formats had become archaic. Storage of magnetic tape is always tricky. I had let some things go because, frankly, this whole world of social media where people can communicate about all these things didn't exist way back when this stuff was created. So the historical value and the idea that fans would actually be interested in this 20 years later was not on my radar. And there I was moving physically, at one point from LA up to Santa Barbara area. And I did move a whole bunch of tapes, but those 2-inch tapes, when every score has like 6 2-inch tape reels, and there were some things that got damaged. There were some things that I let go of. So I don't remember exactly, but they had to piece together the Fright Night score from, I think, some stuff that I had and some stuff that they retrieved from the film company. I'm probably not totally accurate on this, but unfortunately, I wasn't able to supply the pristine original masters that I would like to have done. There was a couple of different ways that they got the stuff, but I was always doing whatever. I was just in my cave, writing music, writing, and I wasn't the best, what would you call it? I wasn't the best librarian for the archives of my work. So Fright Night, I'm glad they put that out and they cobbled together tracks from here and there,
Yes, but it was great to finally get the complete release of your music as you had written it for the picture, in its entirety without, the songs. So basically fans had the chance to experience that as it had been requested, or one of the most requested scores written by you, I believe. At least that's what I believe. And the album has been sold out ever since.
I didn't know that I don't know how many they printed, but I didn't know that they sold it out. That's cool.
Yeah, I think it has become pretty rare actually. And Intrada had released it, and it's become kind of expensive. And I hope they will re-release it, so fans who missed the opportunity to buy it when it was released will finally be able to snatch it at some point.
What I did, the film itself wasn't quite as iconic as Terminator, but the work that I did and the process that I kind of sort of invented to create that score is one of my favorites, because there's a lot of musical chaos and freedom involved, a lot of improvisation on the final tracks of that score. and in a way it's almost in its weird way. It was almost like being a jazz musician, if that makes any sense, because
Yeah.
I was just playing. I was like an organist in an old silent movie, just kind of playing to the screen. And I rigged up this whole method of sitting at the piano, but with this great MIDI device tied to my piano, I could record all these other sounds coming from my improvisation. So it didn't have to be any kind of time signature exactly. It was just impressionistic a lot of the times. I mean, there's some clear themes that are very noticeably organized music, but there was a lot of stuff going on. And of course, Ross Levinson just played his tush off on the electric violin. There's still some people that don't understand. They think like that was like this really cool guitar player, but it was actually electric violin on some of those really burning cues.
And thank you very much for sharing this information with me as well. And now I would love to talk a little bit about your collaboration with Wes Craven, because in the late 80s you had written the score for his film The Serpent and the Rainbow, a score which is a collector's item as well because it is very rare, and the film is one of my favorite horror movies of the 80s, and a very good horror movie by a master of his craft, Wes Craven. What are your thoughts or your recollections of working with Wes Craven back then?
Wow, it's kind of complicated. There's a whole level to that story that, at least in my memory, and this is all my experience, that's all I can really talk about. Wes, who I really liked, super intelligent guy, really smart guy, this was going to be his kind of transition out of horror movies. I mean, that's what I felt in his heart. This came from a best-selling book that was almost more of a political thriller than anything else. It really was dealing with how voodoo and how, people were oppressed in Haiti by Papa Doc, Baby Doc, that whole history of the government of Haiti oppressing the people, and how voodoo, this belief, and I've been to Haiti several times as a kid, so I was very easy for me to plug into that whole vibe, but it was really it was a political thriller in a sense, because you weren't supposed to believe that there really were zombies and really were that it was all done with this drug, and it was done to scare the people and keep them in place. Now that was kind of the book, and then the movie started out that way. There was a love story involved and whatever. And I do remember there was a test screening. So my approach to it was on that basis. I was not really considering that I was scoring a horror movie as much as a thriller with some horrific stuff that happens in it. Hollywood and test audiences weren't really willing to let Wes make that change in such a big way,
Yeah.
So they went back and redid some stuff in the editing and maybe even some reshoots. I may be wrong on that, but that's my memory. And I had to go in and make it a little bit more, as we say in film scoring, stingy. I had to add certain things that made it feel, because the audience really wanted the Wes Craven, jump out of your seat kind of stuff. So it was arrived at that would be given to the audience. So we went back in and did some work on it. I love the score. I love Haiti. It's a place that's very mysterious and interesting and scary and joyous and has a lot of soul. So musically, I was really excited that they came to me to do that. I believe I was at least the second score on that, if not more, because I think they tried to do something with a Haitian, very famous Afro percussionist named Olatunji, who was amazing. I'd listened to him as a kid, but it wasn't really supporting the emotion of the film enough. They realized they needed more of a score versus just percussive sounds. So I came in and did the score, and I used a lot of percussion in it. But anyway, yeah, working with Wes was great. He was really appreciative I had to do this very quickly because it wasn't the first time out for the scoring process. So as they were doing this post-production kind of altering of the ending a bit or whatever they were doing, I jumped in and just quickly got into the whole environment of what he had shot. And I think maybe the reason it's beloved by a lot of people as a horror film is that it had a certain depth to it beyond we're making this movie with just the right formula to scare you. There really was more story behind it and more culture behind it.
Yes. And I think the reason why it still holds up is that it is, at least that's my 2 cents, it is a traditional or quote unquote traditional horror movie. It relies on a story. Wes Craven told the story very well. It does not rely on jump scares,
Right.
as you as it happens so often today, when I feel that a horror movie is predominantly not about the story but about how many jump scares can we possibly put in there, and it has become a whole different game, at least for me personally. So I always appreciate a good horror movie which you know uh, has a very good atmosphere. The story needs to be told because that's the most important thing. Telling
Yes.
this, telling the story, creating an atmosphere that scares you, that fascinates you, and many horror films today lack these attributes. So it's very sad because and I think Wes Craven was a master. He has done Nightmare on Elm Street, Scream, and so many other really good movies. And Serpent and the Rainbow certainly stands as one of his best.
Yeah, and I think that everything that you're talking about gives the composer the opportunity to create a palette that's more layered and has more depth to it. I mean, there's a spiritual element to the beliefs of these people in Haiti, and there are moments, when there's these people with torches, going up this mountainside, and certain, vistas, certain things that you don't usually find in a horror film that allowed me to musically it had there was space for me to come from my heart musically, not just from let's scare the audience.
Yeah, so I mean, I totally agree, and it is so nice to let's say find an audience today which still appreciates this kind of filmmaking, as opposed to the modern take, which can be overbearing at times. And I feel the focus is slightly off, but that's a whole different story in itself, I believe.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because I got asked recently to contribute to some kind of compendium about quote horror composers, and I never really thought of myself that way. In fact, I'm not a fan of horror movies per se, and every score that I ever did, I had to find a place. It maybe limits me as a composer, but basically, I couldn't find. I had to fall in love with something in that project, and a strict horror film is hard to do that. I had to find a place to attach my heart, and then the music would start to flow. So yeah, I mean, without even judging what's the better kind of movie, I just wasn't the best candidate to do what I would think of might, especially now, be considered strictly a horror movie.
You have had a very tremendous output. I mean, you worked on horror movies, on action pictures, thrillers, The Accused, Blue Steel, Blank, and so many others. And of course, True Lies, being one of my favorite action movies of all time. And I think your score was really good. The main title was fantastic. The action music was spot on in the picture. But after you had left Hollywood, you also tried to focus on a different kind of music. And you also presented your one-man musical, if you will, which was called Borrowed Time. Could you tell me and our audience a little bit about that and how it came about and how you realized this project?
It's funny because I just completed not long ago another project called Full Circle. And I'd actually started that one first, and it was a musical with a full cast of characters. Had nothing to do with me. I didn't see myself in it in any way. It was just I came up with an original story. I wrote the script, I wrote the songs, and I was working on it and recording demos. And then I started to look at the world of musicals and see what was going on. And it seemed like after leaving Hollywood, and that was really, that story is so funny with social media, but that was kind of a mutual agreement. I mean, basically, I moved out of LA. I didn't want to live there anymore, but I thought I was close enough and envisioned myself continuing with my career. But it didn't work out that way. The things I was being offered weren't things I was excited about. And, so it wasn't just me saying no to Hollywood, which is I've seen written that I turned my back or I walked. I would love to have continued to work on quality projects, but ironically, and I don't think I'm the only one to have this experience, as I reached what I felt was a deeper understanding of my craft after doing it for 25 years, the work that I was being offered and the way that I was being kind of treated, communicated with, was going backwards. To come from in 1980 working with Arthur Miller on Playing for Time, which won the Emmy that year, not my score, but the entire project, with wonderful performers and deep story. To the stuff that I was being offered mostly because people wanted some echoing of my percussive Terminator type thing, but they wanted it on a project that wasn't particularly top notch, and for a while I kind of kept going. I took on whatever came, but I started to move away from it. And I was coming of a certain age. I was approaching 50 years old. And I started to remember, and to go literally, back to where we started in this interview, I remembered as a kid, my dream of music was to look at the world and then find a musical way to reflect what I saw and mirror it back to an audience, whether it was songs or pure music, but just to that, some very egotistical belief that almost every artist has to have, which is that I had something to offer, that my reflection of the world with whatever talents I might be able to scrape up had some value. And I kind of, really long, midlife crisis, I wanted to go back to that. Like, I've been doing my best, luckily for some very good project, but also for a lot of mediocre work, making my contribution to somebody else's vision, right? So
Yes.
whether it's director or producer or writer, okay, where's the music? And when people came to me with kind of a clean slate and said, Brad, this is what we have. What would you bring to this? What can you bring to this? That was very exciting. It didn't have to be my solo thing. There was a lot of space in that. And luckily, whether it be a Terminator, a Fright Night, a Serpent and the Rainbow, The Accused, most of those projects, there was a lot of space for me to bring in my expression. I wasn't told in advance what kind of music they wanted. I wasn't played other music as an example of what they wanted me to imitate. It started to become more and more like that. So coming from that, I thought, what can I do? And I started to write this musical that was an interesting story. I won't get into here. It would take too long. And I started to realize how daunting it would be to raise the money. And then, retroactively, I really appreciated anybody who got anything made, because it's one thing to have people come to you with a project all assembled and give you money to write the music. It's another thing to start something from the ground up and actually get out into the world and find a way to get it produced. That's not necessarily my talent, my strong point. So Borrowed Time came from a place of, what can I do that I could just get on stage myself? I don't have to sell it to anybody else. I'll just put it together. I'll be the performer. And this story started to evolve that was really about my life. But I can't describe it, almost like I was a character. So this is a story about a young kid who grows up in the 60s in the middle of all that turmoil and grows up in that place when all the young people felt they were going to change the world for the better, right?
Yes.
In a big way. The Woodstock, the everything that was happening, marching on Washington, all these things that I was getting tear gassed, all these things I was involved in. And then he goes into his life with that intent and thinks his path to do it is to become a rock and roll star and be able to get on stage in front of a lot of people and sing his songs about the world, about whatever. And that doesn't really take off. And then he gets this opportunity to write music for film. It's just my story. But what was interesting is as it unfolded, I realized that through all of it, from 16 on, I had written personal songs the whole time. There wasn't a time, maybe a couple of years, but things would happen. I went through a divorce. I wrote a whole album worth of songs coming out of that, different things. So I realized, wow, this is a musical, and the songs for this musical were written by the composer at the actual times that he was experiencing this life's journey. So that's what Borrowed Time was. I put together this whole thing that involved some of the characters and people and situations I'd got involved in the music business, in the film business, all the way through to the end, basically.
Yes.
That moment. There's a point in that show where I'm pacing the stage saying, maybe if Jim had hired me for Titanic, it's very real. I totally exposed myself. I just tore it all away. I realized the more I had a woman expert in one-person shows, and she said, a one-person show is always all about you. So get over not wanting it to be about you and making it more theoretical. So I just kept peeling away. So you see me angsting over my divorce. You see me doing all these things. So I went out and did that. The people who saw it were very moved by it. I mean, I had people hugging me and crying on my shoulder because it spoke universally to people who have a dream as a teenager.
Yeah.
And as they get older, they compromise. And all of a sudden, I'm writing music for a film that I don't even really like. That the songs I wrote through my whole life that came from my heart, that I'm out there playing them for you. And that is kind of the resolution of my journey, that these songs that nobody's heard, basically, except a few people in the club somewhere or whatever. So that was Borrowed Time. And frankly, whenever we did it, we had a really great response. But again, getting a show like that, we did various attempts, but it's never really gotten out in a wide sense. I've played it in several places in California, a little bit in Arizona, but I basically realized I'm not the natural promoter.
Oh yeah.
So I realized unless somebody who saw or heard the show said, I'm going to take this and run with it, and I'm going to make sure, we had this one woman who got very excited and she was going to represent the show, but nothing really happened. So that's kind of dormant at the moment. I kind of done with it. I got it off my chest. I performed it for several hundred people ultimately in various venues. And now I'm back to working on the full-fledged musical that I'm going to release. And I haven't told, this is an exclusive. I'm going to release the audio, like an audio book, a musical, but like an audio book. You can just sit and listen to it with all the dialogue and the narration and all the songs. I'm going to release it online in some fashion because I don't want to deal with theaters and all that stuff. Life's kind of too short. Unless maybe somebody will hear it and say, we want to put this on stage. But I want to keep writing music, and that other stuff is a huge time-consuming distraction from actual creation.
Yes.
So anyway, that'll be out. I hope in this next year there'll be some way, whether it's audible.com, I don't know where exactly, but there'll be a way that the audience will be able to download Brad Fiedel's full musical Full Circle.
Great. I'm looking forward to it. And let me just say, it is great to have audience members come up to you and express their gratitude or even start crying on your shoulder. And many people have a dream, they have a vision, they have a goal, but they struggle to achieve those goals because it can be very nerve-wracking and you can get easily discouraged. So it's not easy to really fulfill your own dream and your vision. And you certainly, I believe, have been one of those fortunate people to really live your dream. You know, you became a very successful musician and composer. If you still have a couple of minutes, I would love to ask the question, since we just talked about realizing one's goals and being persistent and so on, which advice would you actually give to people as to, let's say, or let me rephrase, what do you think is essential for anybody in order to realize their dream?
Oh my gosh. It's a question I ask myself probably almost every morning. Uh, you know, and sometimes the pressure to feel like you kind of you've lived your most ultimate expression of what you were, quote, born to do or what you feel, can be a pressure that can tie you in knots. So one of the things is to keep breathing, always, to be quiet sometimes. I'm just telling you what works for me. I'm at a place right now where I'm kind of trying to figure out what direction. I have some options as what I kind of push in my life, what I move forward with. The people I admire are the people who are coming from their hearts, basically. That's a real cliche, and I don't even know what heart really means. But I think we all know when we are coming from our truth, which is an interesting word these days, when we're coming from something true inside of us, or whether we're trying to be successful by doing what we think we should try to do, right? To
Yes.
me, that doesn't work. So what works, I think, and it may work that you end up writing something or creating something or making a painting or whatever,
Yes.
that hardly anybody experiences. But if it's real and authentic and you get to express it, it's like even if you write a book that doesn't get published, it's the process. To me, it's all about, if the process is true and authentic, it's fulfilling. And I think your soul knows that you're living up to your promise, regardless of what happens between that creation, that expression, and the public.
Yes.
I think we owe our work to be good parents and try to get it out there as successfully as possible. But I think that what I've discovered is I don't want that to stop the work. The fact that I've written 3 or 4 musicals that hardly anybody has heard, some people have heard them. I've heard them. I got to write them. I got to sit in the universe and create these expressions, and singers came in and sang them and experienced them. I think we get too judgmental.
Yes.
Okay, so this is what I'll end with. I think we get too judgmental about what success is.
Yes, that's very true. I mean, everybody should have their own opinion as to what success really means, be it becoming a professional musician or just, having a family and settle down. So everybody has their own take on these things. But I think to wrap things up, I believe everybody should have their own vision and a goal, something to strive for, something to look forward to, something to, well, having a goal is always important for any person, or should be important for any person. We should strive for creating something, strive to create something which is worthwhile, and
I just want to say that there's creativity everywhere. So and it's interesting having children and watching where they go. But you don't have to be an, quote, artist to be creative. You
Yes.
can be creative in so many different ways. So I think that's something else. I've had people say, oh, look what you've done and you're so creative. I'm not creative at all. When in reality, everything you do is a creation in a sense, So how you do what you do in the world and how you interrelate, like I think being a kind person, this is again a cliche, at this point in history, just being kind
Yes.
is an amazing contribution and a creation.
Yes. This day and age, kindness or being kind is an achievement in itself.
Right. In spite of your own stress, in spite of everything else,
I would like to thank you very much for taking so much time out of your busy schedule. I really appreciate that. I have been meaning to talk to you for so many years, and now we finally realized that, and I got the chance to finally interview you, which was a pleasure, and I hope you enjoyed the conversation as well.
I did very much, Michael, and I've been kind of gun shy because I did a bunch of things at one point, and I felt like I was, answering a lot of the same questions, but I really enjoyed this conversation, and I'm very glad that we got to do it. Thank you.